feedback on how these webinars, in particular this webinar, meets your company's need to move towards safer chemistry. So we'd love your feedback, and you'll have an opportunity to do a survey at the end of this webinar. So I encourage you to do that. So now it's time to introduce our webinar for today. The GreenScreen for Safer Chemicals is a method for comparative chemical hazard screening to help move our society quickly and effectively towards the use of greener and safer chemicals. The GreenScreen is helping major companies such as Hewlett-Packard and governments to substitute hazardous chemicals with safer alternatives. This webinar will provide you with an overview of the GreenScreen tool and information on upcoming training. And Shari Franjevic will be presenting the webinar today. And I've known Shari for a long time. And Shari is a green chemistry and sustainable design consultant with Transform to Green LLC. Shari has been partnering with organizations such as Clean Production Action, and who again is the author of the GreenScreen, and facilitates diverse multi-stakeholder groups such as the USEPA Design for the Environment technical committees. And really the focus of her work is to advance the understanding of and promote design and use of green chemicals, sustainable materials, and environmentally preferable products. Shari began her career in industry, so she has that unique perspective and she led research and design projects for consumer products companies such as Procter & Gamble, Frito-Lay, and General Mills, and 3M. And she earned her Bachelor's of Science in Chemical Engineering from the University of Wisconsin. And so now I will turn it over to Shari to introduce the GreenScreen for Safer Chemicals.
Thank you, Teresa. And thank you to the National Pollution Prevention Roundtable for inviting me to speak today on the Safer Chemistry Challenge Program webinar series. I really believe this is a great, the Safer Chemistry Challenge Program is a fantastic for companies to get recognition. So it's our pleasure to be a part of this work and this grant. And thank you all for tuning in today. So in my talk today, I will be speaking on behalf of Clean Production Action and really providing you with a high-level overview of the GreenScreen for Safer Chemicals. And all the slides and information that I will be presenting have been developed by Clean Production Action. So I'll start by saying a little bit about the organization. Clean Production Action is a nonprofit organization, and they focus on strategic and pragmatic solutions in 3 key areas, and that is green chemicals, sustainable materials, and environmentally preferable products. And Action has 2 flagship projects, the first being the Business NGO Working Group, and that is a really unique collaboration between businesses and nonprofit environmental advocacy organizations, aligning on common goals, really looking to seek solutions, create solutions, share best practices, and develop resources to meet these goals that are shared amongst the entire group of these safer chemicals and more sustainable materials. And the Business NGO Working Group has created a number of really useful work products. They started by releasing some foundational principles for safer chemicals, and then building off of that developed the Guide to Safer Chemicals, which is a roadmap that allows companies not only to look at where they are and kind of diagnose where they are on this journey towards implementing safer chemicals within their organization and supply chain, but also gives an aspirational map and some goals and some steps to take along the way to continue to move in that direction. The most recent of their work products is the Chemical Alternative Assessment Protocol, which looks at how to select safer materials and incorporating everything from comparative chemical hazard assessment, which will be the focus of our talk today, and incorporating that into broader considerations as well, and how to, a guide to think through that and how to implement that within organizations. The second key flagship program of clean production action is the GreenScreen for Safer Chemicals, which is the focus of the talk today. And the actual decision-making methodology is really the foundation of that GreenScreen program within clean production action. However, the organization is also currently putting efforts into building a supporting infrastructure to help bring this GreenScreen to scale and into industry, support uptake, and address ease of use and sharing of results. So the program includes developments in areas such as automation and validation and repositories for completed assessment. So what is the GreenScreen? The GreenScreen is a method for comparative chemical hazard assessment. And what I'm going to be covering today are, I'm going to start with some key foundational concepts that form the basis for the GreenScreen. Then I'm going to talk about how the GreenScreen works and how to actually do an assessment. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about some case studies and applications for the GreenScreen, who's using it and how they're using it. So the first foundational principle that the GreenScreen is based upon is green chemistry. And I'm sure most of you are aware of the definition of green chemistry that was put out by Paul Anastas and John Warner, including reducing or eliminating the use or generation of hazardous substances. And they, in their pivotal work, Green Chemistry Theory and Practice, they've outlined 12 principles for green chemistry to really focus on reducing risks by reducing the inherent hazard of chemicals and products and processes. And 5 of those 12 principles are directly incorporated into the GreenScreen methodology, and those are listed on the right-hand side. And what the GreenScreen really looks to do is take these foundational principles and develop metrics for how to pragmatically implement those principles within a product or process. So, for example, principle number 5, use safer solvents and auxiliaries. The GreenScreen asks, okay, how do we identify those safer solvents and auxiliaries to implement into our process? And I just wanted to say a little bit more about risk and hazard, because we get a lot of questions about this. So risk is a function of both hazard and exposure. And both risk assessment and hazard assessment are really key tools to have in your toolbox. And the GreenScreen really is a hazard assessment tool. And one of the things that you need to ask yourself when you're looking at using a tool is, what is that tool designed to do well? And what is the question that it addresses? And the question that risk assessment really seeks to answer is this chemical or product safe enough for its intended use and or foreseeable misuse? Whereas hazard assessment is really designed to answer the question, which chemical is inherently safer? So both of these tools are valuable tools, and when you're in the design phase really selecting chemicals, a hazard assessment can be a really key step in this process. The second key concept that the GreenScreen is based upon is the idea of chemical functionality. And this comes out of the work of the USEPA Design for the Environment program. And the basic idea here is that every chemical that's found in a product is there because it serves a particular function. It has a job to do. Maybe it's providing color, or it's stabilizing from degradation, or it's making a plastic more flexible. And so when making material selection decisions, taking a step back and identifying the function that that chemical is providing within the formulated product or article, then allows you to take a look at all the alternatives that can deliver that function and compare them on that basis, which leads to this third key concept, the concept of hazard banding. And the idea here is basically that a chemical, based on its structure as well as its physical chemical properties, has a set of inherent toxicity characteristics. So you can take those chemicals or those alternatives and essentially place them along a continuum. And on one end of the continuum, there are characteristics of ingredients of concern, and on the other end of that continuum are characteristics of safer ingredients. And this concept, while Clean Production Action points primarily to the US EPA's Design for the Environment program, this concept is seen nationally and internationally. And another key place that this concept is a foundation for is the globally harmonized system for classification and labeling of chemicals. So a little bit about the origins of the GreenScreen. So back in about 2005, 2006, the US EPA Design for the Environment program brought together its first partnership program, and at that time they were looking at flame retardant alternatives for furniture foam. And they brought together stakeholders from business, academia, government, and nonprofit organizations to identify potential alternatives and assess those alternatives. At that same time, a number of states were looking to ban decabromo-diphenyl ether, and Clean Production Action was interested in building on the work that the US EPA's partnership program had done, and they released this case study looking at decabromo-diphenyl ether and two alternatives, because essentially what the states needed for their ban was evidence that there was indeed a safer alternative to move towards for companies. And so Clean Production Action integrated the work of the US EPA's Design for the Environment program and built upon it. And within this case study is embedded the actual methodology of the GreenScreen for Safer Chemicals that has since been pulled out of the case study as an independent methodology. So a little bit more of the US EPA Design for the Environment program alternative assessment partnerships. One of the key things that came out of this initial partnership, which is really the foundation of comparative chemical hazard assessment, is the hazard summary table that I'll talk about a little bit further, which really distilled a lot of information into a single image. The Design for the Environment program continues to be an active program at the US EPA, and in fact they have partnerships right now on all the EPA Action Plan chemicals. And in addition to that, the hazard criteria that form the basis of the hazard summary table have continued to evolve with the state of the science, as well as increase in transparency. And in fact, as recently as August of last year, they released their latest chemical alternative assessment criteria document, and the website is listed there. So this is sort of the hallmark of chemical hazard assessment, table 4-1, and this is what came out of that initial furniture flame retardant partnership. And one of the reasons that this was such a huge step forward is because what this table does is it takes hundreds and hundreds of pages of toxicological data, professional judgment assessments, analogs, and all that information, and distills it down to a single image that can be integrated relatively easily. So it's really densely packed with information and crystallized. And I'll just walk through it briefly. On the left-hand side, you'll see the chemical name, and there's a number of products with the ingredient chemicals listed underneath them. Across the top, you have the hazard endpoints that are covered. And in the middle, in the matrix, what you have is a hazard assessment for each chemical for each hazard endpoint. And those are high, moderate, or low hazard. The second piece of information that's actually displayed there is the level of confidence in that hazard call. So if you look at the very first line, the top chemical, under cancer hazard, you'll see a bold orange M for moderate hazard. And the fact that it's bold and colored means that there's a high level of confidence in that call. Similarly, on the same line, for bioaccumulation, you'll see an italic black L, which means low hazard, and that italic black letter indicates that it's a lower level of confidence. So it may be that that call was based on a very low weight of evidence, or perhaps only estimated data were available. So out of this partnership was this incredible piece of work, and the next thing that companies were charged to do was go out and take this information to actually select a safer alternative. And when looking at this information, the next logical question was, well, how do we now use this really complex, still somewhat complex information to make a decision? And they started asking questions like, do we just count up how many H's there are across the board, or how many M's? And there was really a need for a more structured decision logic that would be repeatable and clear. And that's where clean production action stepped in. So, and that's where the GreenScreen really has a value add. And what the GreenScreen is, again, is a comparative chemical hazard assessment approach developed by Clean Production Action, built upon the work of the Design for the Environment program. And the key value add is that it takes that information from the hazard assessment, and then with this structured decision logic allows you to essentially bin chemicals in these benchmarks from 1 to 4, going back to that concept of hazard banding that we talked about earlier. So it gives chemicals an overall score. And the GreenScreen, like the Design for the Environment alternatives assessment criteria, continues to evolve with advancements in science as well as user feedback. So you'll see a number of versions. The most recent one launched in October of 2011. So why are companies being drawn and regulatory bodies being drawn to this particular methodology? Well, what Clean Production Action has heard is some of the key selling points are that the GreenScreen is publicly accessible. All the information can be downloaded from the Clean Production Action website. It's completely transparent. All the criteria for both the hazard assessment as well as the benchmarking are completely laid out. There are no black boxes with this methodology. It's also peer-reviewed, and in fact, Clean Production Action has a rigorous process for developing and revising the method, which includes a broad technical advisory committee, and for major revisions, an international peer review process with experts. And both the technical advisory committee and the peer review process are from a broad range of stakeholders, again, academia, industry, government, and nonprofit. So now just a little bit about how it works. The GreenScreen incorporates 3 key steps. The first step is to assess and classify hazards. And in that step, essentially, you're generating the hazard summary table that we spoke about earlier in the context of the Design for the Environment program. The second step is to apply the benchmarks, and this is that key value out of the GreenScreen. It's the decision logic that places chemicals along a continuum. And the third step is to make informed decisions. And this means taking all the information, both the benchmark of the chemical, the hazard summary table, as well as any additional information to make this business decision. So it needs to be incorporated into a broader context to actually make that informed decision. It may be specific company priorities or other life cycle considerations, things like that. I'm going to go through each step in a little bit more detail. So here are, for the first step, these are the hazard endpoints included in the GreenScreen, and it is a relatively comprehensive set of hazard endpoints, and it's also a relatively harmonized set of hazard endpoints. The hazard classification piece is the piece that the intention is to really harmonize this piece of the process. So some of the primary sources for those hazard endpoints and criteria include the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals, the US EPA, both the New Chemicals Program, as well as the Design for the Environment program, and OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, Screening Information Data Set. And the hazard endpoints are grouped into a number of groups. The first is Human Health Group 1, which are predominantly chronic health effects, relatively severe health effects. Group 2, which tend to be either acute effects or potency-based effects. Then there's environmental toxicity and fate, and the physical hazards. For each of these hazard endpoints, there are very detailed criteria that allow each of these hazard endpoints to be classified for a chemical and given a score from very high down to very low, depending on the hazard endpoints. There may be 3 to 5 levels. In this case, for acute mammalian toxicity as an example, there are 4 hazard levels. And you'll see that there are criteria for measured data or estimated data, for that matter, and that is based largely on the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling, or GHS. And then there are also list-based criteria. And the purpose of the list-based criteria is really to leverage reviews that have already been done. If a chemical has been comprehensively reviewed by experts, been vetted in the scientific community, there's really no reason to those types of assessments. And so that information can be leveraged. And what Clean Production Action has done is taken over 500 lists and list categories and mapped them into the hazard classification, and then through partnerships have automated this process so that over 500 lists can be searched and a hazard table populated with that portion of the assessment within seconds, which really then allows the experts to spend their time looking at these sources of data and using their professional judgment in terms of weight of evidence and finding suitable surrogates and filling in data gaps. So I'll speak a little bit more about filling in the hazard table. In making these hazard calls, a comprehensive search of available information is done. So that includes scientific literature, test data, and professional judgment is also a huge part of this. So when there's not measured data, then estimations, models, analogs, read across are incorporated to fill all the available information. I will point out as well that in some cases, there is insufficient information to make an assessment on a specific hazard endpoint. And in those cases, the hazard rating you'll see is a DG, and that stands for data gap. And this could be the case for a number of reasons. Perhaps there's an unknown mechanism of action or no suitable analog, or the available models don't apply to that specific class of chemicals. So if there's really limited information, then that is going to be highlighted with a data gap. So this hazard summary table indicates both the known hazards based on all available information and professional judgment, as well as the uncertainty about the hazard of a chemical. So the second step is to apply the benchmark. And this is the place where the values of the GreenScreen are really embedded in here. And there are some value judgments that are built into these different bins of chemicals as you roll all this hazard information into a score from 1 to 4. And I will point out that the co-authors of the GreenScreen, Lauren Hine and Mark Rossi with Clean Production Action, did make attempts to align those benchmarks, particularly benchmark 1, with key regulatory drivers. So there's general harmonization nationally and internationally about what are attributes of really high concern amongst chemicals, the really bad actors, such as CMRs or carcinogens or mutagens or reproductive or developmental toxicants, and PBTs, which are persistent and bioaccumulative and toxic chemicals. So they did align that, and you'll see that reflected in the benchmark 1 chemicals. Benchmark 4 is really the aspirational goal of low hazard across the board, and then there's a stepwise process in between to get from benchmark 1 to benchmark 4. And how it works is you essentially start at the bottom and you ask yourself the question, is this chemical, for example, benchmark 1A, is this chemical a PVT? If the answer is yes, you fail that criteria and essentially you stay there, you're a benchmark 1 chemical. If the answer is no, you go to the next question. So benchmark 1B asks, is this chemical very persistent and very bioaccumulative? If the answer is yes, again, you fail. It's a benchmark 1 chemical. If the answer is no, you pass and go down to the second criteria. You go all the way through the benchmark 1s. If the answer is no for all of those, you proceed to the criteria for benchmark 2 and work your way up. I will say briefly that one of the key additions to GreenScreen version 1.2 was adding in another level of assessment in the benchmarking, which requires higher and higher levels of data requirements to reach each benchmark level. And that is really laid out in great detail in the GreenScreen guidance document. But essentially, if a chemical, for example, based on available data, were to be able to achieve a benchmark 3, but it was missing some really key information, it may be downgraded, for example, to a benchmark 2DG, subscript DG, indicating that based on lack of information, it's actually a benchmark 2 because it doesn't meet the data requirements for benchmark 3. So out of this assessment, what you get is, this is an excerpt from an actual GreenScreen assessment, and you'll see the overall GreenScreen rating for this chemical, for example, is a benchmark 2, and it has the rationale. And you'll also see that the hazard summary table is listed there as well. So you get both of those pieces of information to move forward and make an informed decision. And the third step is to do just that. This slide actually comes from some work that was done by Hewlett-Packard. So one of the things that you can do with the results of the GreenScreen is you can compare results for a specific functional use. So for example, you have a bunch of flame retardants. You can group those flame retardants by the benchmark that they achieve, and that gives you some preliminary information about their relative hazard in making a decision. And these scores and this information, once it gets to the level of a benchmark, can then be used by folks without that toxicological expertise to really understand the complexity of that original hazard summary table. So maybe engineers or procurement professionals. However, that hazard table is also a part of the information that can be used and is used to make an informed decision. So I'm going to speak just a little bit more about some application highlights. So Hewlett-Packard is currently the leading practitioner of the GreenScreen for Safer Chemicals, and this is an excerpt from their Global Citizenship Report. And they have made a commitment to replace restricted substances with materials that are better for the environment and human health. And the key tool that they're using is the GreenScreen for Safer Chemicals. So a little bit about why they would be investing in this kind of work, and why companies are looking for these kinds of tools. One of the key reasons is that substance restrictions are on the rise. They're a major class of regulation for electronics and for lots of different product categories. More substances are being restricted in more jurisdictions with more reporting requirements, and in some cases, alternatives assessments are even being specified in state legislation. So the trend in regulations is moving in this direction, and these regulations tend to be based on the inherent hazard of chemicals. So how have companies historically approached replacing restricted substances? they've looked at all the available alternatives and said any unregulated substance is deemed equal, of equal value, and then traditional considerations for selection have been things like cost, function, reliability, manufacturability, all really important considerations. And really, the main issue with this approach, of course, is the risk that you take of making a regrettable substitution. So jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. In many cases, all unregulated substances are not created equal, and oftentimes a substance that's structurally very similar to the substance that's been restricted may have limited data, or it hasn't been restricted yet, but it may be on the docket for the next round of restrictions. So a more proactive approach that many businesses are now adopting is to ensure that the replacements that they're selecting indeed have lower environmental impact than the materials that have been restricted that they're moving away from. And they want to do this for a number of reasons, definitely to avoid unintended consequences or impacts on human and environmental health. But they want to make sure that they're future-proofing. There's a huge risk, and there's a very strong business case, because essentially it's really expensive to replace materials, and you want to get it right the first time. So for a company the size of Hewlett-Packard with that complexity of supply chain, they estimate that it costs them anywhere between $5 and $50 million to replace a single chemical in their supply chain. So it makes really good business sense to get it right the first time. So how did Hewlett-Packard get into this process of using the GreenScreen? They started out actually looking at a lot of different tools on the marketplace and assessing them, seeing what tools might be useful for their purposes. And they found the GreenScreen and started a small pilot program. And through that pilot program, they found that the GreenScreen was effectively differentiating between alternatives. And so their program has matured over the years to now they're at a point where for specific chemicals that they're replacing, it's actually they require their suppliers to submit a GreenScreen assessment of the chemical along with other information, and it is a gate of entry. You have to meet a certain benchmark requirement in addition to other performance and cost criteria to even be considered as an alternative for that application. And the other piece that I will emphasize is that Hewlett-Packard does continue to use a lot of different tools for alternative assessment and material selection, and comparative chemical hazard assessment is an important tool in their toolbox, but not the only one. They still look at other considerations, cost, performance. They use risk assessment, life cycle assessment, but that the comparative chemical hazard assessment is a really important, and especially early in the process, to ensure that they are indeed selecting something that's inherently safer than what's being replaced. The second example that I have is a company called Poly1, and they are a plastic supplier, manufacturer, supplier of halogen and phthalate-free products. And they got into the use of the GreenScreen actually because they are a supplier of Hewlett-Packard, and that's how they were introduced to the GreenScreen. And you can imagine that some companies may be pushed into these things kicking and screaming when they're forced to use a new tool or process. But Poly1 actually found that the GreenScreen was incredibly valuable to them as a product design and development tool. They found that it was really useful for them to, as a systematic way to look at what was going into their products, what were the inherent hazards of those different ingredients, and they were able to identify in some cases a chemical of concern or high hazard that maybe wasn't really creating enough value to stay in that product, or where they did have a known alternative of lower hazard. And of course, that's not always going to be the case. There's going to be cases where there are no known alternatives that are of low enough hazard, and that's where you really identify these green chemistry challenges where you need to put out to suppliers and to chemists, we need to invent a new molecule that meets this function that has a lower hazard, and those are going to be the case as well. And actually the GreenScreen can support identification of those green chemistry challenges and really focus efforts in that way by identifying places where there aren't safer alternatives as well. So I'll just speak very, very briefly on the uptake of the GreenScreen. Certainly seen a number of industries that have been particularly interested in the GreenScreen and active in this area, including the building industry, electronics, retail, and that's sort of in the realm of downstream users. We've also had a lot of interest from a number of proactive chemical manufacturers that are finding this as a really valuable tool to communicate with their supply chain and to market the products that they have to offer. There have been a number of pilot projects as well with different consortia and different groups coming together to do assessments. The Green Chemistry and Commerce Council has come together with a working group, and they did a pilot project looking at alternative plasticizers for wire and cable applications, have done a number of assessments in that model. And there was a second pilot looking at flame retardant alternatives. Group the Phosphorus Inorganic Nitrogen Flame Retardant Association came together and did a number of assessments on alternatives to halogenated flame retardant. So now I'm going to take a step back before I transition into the final section of my talk and just say a few words about comparative chemical hazard assessment as a whole. We are seeing increasing demand for this type of a tool, both in business and regulatory realms. It is no longer considered acceptable or sufficient to just select materials based on cost and performance. And in fact, inherent hazards of chemicals are now even being seen as quality features or quality defects, especially due to the risk that it leads for the company, regulatory risk or environmental and human health risk. Comparative chemical hazard assessment is necessary but not sufficient for material selection decisions. So it's a tool in the toolkit, a really valuable tool, and it can be used in conjunction with other traditional tools and some of the newer tools that are coming out, risk assessment, life cycle assessment, carbon footprinting. And the GreenScreen is a leading method for comparative chemical hazard assessment for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. It is science-based, publicly accessible, transparent, comprehensive, and really builds on a foundation of national and international precedent and is harmonized wherever feasible. And the other piece about the GreenScreen, again, is that there are a lot of efforts underway to really build an infrastructure that supports broader adoption of this methodology. So there are efforts in the areas of public repositories, so we don't need to do multiple assessments of the same chemical. We can share those results, and partnerships to develop software for automating portions of the assessment that can be automated, such as a partnership with the Works, automating the GreenScreen list translator into their GreenWorks tool, and a second partnership with the Healthy Building Network, automating the list translator into their Pharos database for building materials. So now I just want to take a couple of moments to tell you about the upcoming GreenScreen trainings, the first one being on May 8th in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the information is listed there. There are a limited number of spaces available, and this class is actually filling up quite quickly, so if you're interested, I would recommend you register right away. It is being sponsored predominantly by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Region 5 under a grant, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And we have a couple of partners in that grant, including the National Pollution Prevention Roundtable, who are hosting this webinar series, and the Safer Chemistry Challenge program, the Great Lakes Regional Pollution Prevention Roundtable, and Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network. And we have two other sponsors, NSF International, and Teresa introduced me today. They are actually the hosts the event is actually happening at their site. And then the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council, who is having their 7th annual Innovators Roundtable at the same location, May 9th to the 11th. And if you don't know much about that, it's a really valuable group of people and great work, so I would highly recommend considering that as well. This is our speaker lineup, and I'll just highlight a few. Lauren Hine with Clean Production Action is the co-author of the GreenScreen. Helen Holder from Hewlett-Packard does a fantastic job of delivering sort of the business case and the broader business considerations and addressing issues and concerns about how do you actually implement this in a business context, in the broader context of decision making. Emma Lavoie with the USEPA Design for the Environment program is a co-author of the DFE's alternative assessment criteria that came out last year. And then the 2 companies that are qualified by Clean Production Action to do second-party assessments for a fee for companies that don't want to do them in-house are NSF International and Tox Services. Both have incredible experience doing these types of assessments and will be part of the teaching team. And the purpose of the day-long training is really for it to be hands-on, interactive, discussion-oriented, and the target audience is designers and decision makers. And this may be that you are somebody that is actually going to perform these types of assessments for your organization. But another case may be that you may be a consumer of this type of information, a consumer of completed GreenScreen assessments, whether your organization hires out the assessments or somebody in your organization will do them. But you may need to really understand the rigor, the depth, and what goes into this process and this methodology to advocate for adoption of it within your organization or figure out how to implement it. So the training is great for all those folks. I do want to highlight as well that if you can't make it May 8th or if it does fill up, we do plan to do 6 trainings in the Great Lakes region over the through the course of the next 3 years. And the next training is already on the calendar. It's November 15th in Chicago, and it will be held in conjunction with the first regional green chemistry conference being put on by the Great Lakes Regional Pollution Prevention Roundtable and the Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network. And the conference will be the 2 days after, November 16th and 17th. And future trainings will be happening all in the Great Lakes region, and additional information about those, once the dates have been selected, will appear on the Clean Production Action website. And just a little bit more, there's a lot of information on the Clean Production Action website, so I would encourage you to check it out. Under the Spotlight section, there's always the next upcoming training information posted there. There's also a place where you can sign up to be a part of the GreenScreen listserv, and that would be, you would receive updates, for example, if a new revision to the method came out or a new training was being scheduled or different opportunities to engage with the GreenScreen process. So with that, I would like to thank you again, National Pollution Prevention Roundtable and Angela, for inviting me to speak today, and thank you, Teresa. And I believe now we are going to transition into the Q&A.
We did have a question earlier. Someone asked if the slides for the webinar will be available. They will be available at www.p2.org. If you click on webinars on the homepage, it should be up on there immediately after this webinar. Any other questions? We're not getting any more. We're not getting any other questions. And Teresa, do you want to wrap it up?
Sure. I'm wondering too, Teresa, if you wanted to say anything, since NSF International is also a qualified profiler of GreenScreen assessments. If you had anything to add from your experience doing green screen assessments, or any questions that you think might be valuable to bring up?
Yeah. What I find interesting is the level of, well, there's just a lot of excitement behind the GreenScreen tool in general. So we're getting a lot of interest, and like Shari said, the training is filling up really quickly. So please do register if you're interested very quickly here. But we are just seeing a lot of interest, a lot of excitement. I think what I've been hearing is, while HP is one of the largest public users of the GreenScreen, there's a lot of major chemical companies that are using this, and users and chemical users that are using this tool internally, that are actively asking for these GreenScreen reports from their suppliers. So I think that's really exciting, and there's no other tool that really captures this information as elegantly as the GreenScreen does. So I think that's the driver behind this excitement. The other thing that I'd like to point out is really that the tool can be customized to your current state of knowledge. If you are a chemical manufacturer and you're trying to inventory your entire chemical lineup, and you haven't done that before, and you're starting from scratch, doing a full-blown GreenScreen assessment on all of your entire chemical inventory, that might be a little overwhelming for you, and that might be a difficult place for you to start. And one of the tools that Shari touched on that you can do internally, or you can have an outside party do this for you, is running a first screening step. So screening your chemical inventory for those benchmark 1 chemicals. Those are the chemicals that have high concern for key endpoints like carcinogenicity, and those types of screening tools will help you identify those first sets of materials, and you don't need to move forward with a full GreenScreen necessarily on those materials. And you would just, after you've done that screening step, you can move on to the next step. And so you can kind of take this GreenScreen in a stepwise fashion like that, and that's an approach we've seen other companies do who are just getting started and don't have a good picture and of their chemical inventory. Now, alternatively, where the GreenScreen tool is necessary is obviously when you're making those decisions, those substitutions for chemicals of concern, and choosing an alternative chemical, a swap out for those alternatives. That's where it's really critical to make sure that you're doing the full GreenScreen and that you do have the full picture of the hazards associated with that chemical, because it does a great job of laying out those hazards and laying out those data gaps, so you can really see what you know and what are question marks about those chemicals. So that's another nice piece about this tool, is that it is customizable.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that there's sort of levels of engagement, and depending on where you are and what your goals are and where you're engaging, there's ways to engage, and there are these shortcuts and these simplified tools that can get people started on a road, and then you can continue as you increase in sophistication or your needs increase. Then there's this broad toolkit that continues to go in depth to meet those needs as well.
We have gotten some questions in. Can you speak to what sort of modifications or challenges are needed to use the GreenScreen protocol to comply with specific programs, such as the Green Chemistry program under development in California, which incorporates an alternatives analysis and its own database of chemicals of concern?
Sure, and I can speak to this very, very briefly at a very high level, but I will also say that actually at our upcoming training in Ann Arbor, we will have Ann Blake, who is quite heavily involved in the California regulations, and she will be presenting a session on making informed decisions where she'll be talking more about how to use comparative chemical hazard assessments such as the GreenScreen as one step in that broader decision-making process. But essentially, the California regulations call for a broader set of considerations in addition to hazard. And so taking that as your front step of information and then using it to go into some of these broader tools can allow you to select the alternative that will work for your application. The other tool that I will point to as a broad scoping step would be the Chemical Alternative Assessment Protocol that was put out by the Biz NGO Working Group, which again addresses how do you integrate this comparative chemical hazard assessment into these broader alternative assessment frameworks, and how do you think about that? And there's actually a flow chart and some decision logic that walks you through where the GreenScreen fits in specifically and how you would make the decision of whether you need to go on to do, for example, life cycle assessment or risk assessment. So there are some really great tools that are out there, but essentially the GreenScreen fits in very well in the hazard portion of that broader assessment. There's also another effort underway by the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse developing some guidance around alternatives assessment, which is also doing that same thing where they're looking at how do we spell out for organizations, you know, what are the steps to doing a broader alternatives assessment, and hazard assessment is always a key part of that gets integrated into that decision-making process.
Thank you, Shari. We have one more question. Has there been thought on turning this methodology and tool into an actual standard for chemical hazard assessment?
Yes, that's a great question. There's definitely been constant conversation about whether to turn the methodology into a standard. And up until this point, comparative chemical hazard assessment has been a relatively young area, and it's been really evolving quite quickly. And for that reason, there's been a lot of hesitation on a lot of different fronts to really start setting things in stone, because once it's a standard, it really it stays much more static, and it's been evolving much more quickly because it's such a young area. And I think that as this area continues to mature, there may be, again, considerations to head in that direction. I will also say that the rigor with which the methodology is being put out is becoming more and more like a standard. There's more and more information, and it's becoming more and more transparent and spelled out. So as things are evolving and developing, it is heading in that direction, and it just hasn't, up until this point, been time yet.
Great. Thank you, Shari. Teresa?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you, Shari, and thank you to everyone who's attended and listened through this conference, this webinar. And I'd like to just reiterate and thank our partners who made this webinar possible: Clean Production Action, Great Lakes Pollution Prevention Roundtable, and the Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network, as well as the Safer Chemistry Challenge Program. I'd like to remind everyone on the call that please do complete the survey. You'll be receiving that shortly. We very much value your feedback, and we'll use that to improve our future conferences. I also like to remind you to register for the upcoming webinar, the May 21st Lubrication Technologies Case Study, and remind you of the GreenScreen Training being held in May in conjunction with the Green Chemistry and Commerce Conference, the GC3 Conference in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at NSF International. So please do register for that. And if you can't get into the training, there is that next training in November. And that is in conjunction, like Shari mentioned, with the Green Chemistry Conference. please, for further information, take a look at our website. Angela, I think there might be a slide with our website on there, the p2.org /challenge. And please do consider joining the Safer Chemistry Challenge program. If you have additional questions about that, you can either contact me or contact Angela for more information. You can also email us at saferchemistry@gmail.com. So with that, thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing from you at our next webinar.
Thank you.